The city stretched out beneath a sky thick with clouds, the kind that felt as if they were suffocating the very air. The buildings towered like giants, their glass faces reflecting the harsh, unforgiving light. The streets buzzed with the hum of tired lives, but amidst the noise, there was an eerie silence that seemed to surround her. She walked alone, a figure lost in the crowd but standing out all the same. Her head was low, her eyes cast downward, but there was something in the way she moved, calm, controlled, as if she had the power to make the world pause with just a single step. Her name was Elena, but that didn't matter to most people. To them, she was just another nobody, a face in the crowd, another shadow passing through the streets of a city that never cared. Her clothes were simple, nothing flashy, nothing that would make her stand out. But beneath the plain fabric, there was a fire. It burned quietly, hidden beneath the surface. But Elena knew it was there. She had always known. It was a fire that had kept her going, despite the oppressive weight of a world that wanted her to stay small. She had always been underestimated. People saw her and thought, just another girl, a girl who didn't belong, who didn't have power, who didn't matter. But power isn't always what you can see. It's often something much deeper, something hidden in plain sight, waiting to be unleashed. As she passed by the corner, the sharp screech of tires made her glance up for just a moment. The police car had pulled over to the side of the street, its sirens barely audible above the clamor of the busy traffic. She recognized the officer in the car before he even stepped out. His name was Officer Damon Hayes, and he was the kind of cop who had a reputation for making his own rules. The kind of cop who didn't see people as human beings, but as mere obstacles to be crushed under the weight of his own sense of power. Hayes's eyes flicked over her, but it wasn't a look of recognition. To him, she was just another nameless face in a city filled with them. Another nobody. Elena felt the chill that ran down her spine, the weight of his gaze as he stepped out of the car. It wasn't just the look. It was the air of arrogance that hung around him like a cloud. She had seen it before, this unspoken assumption that he was untouchable, that he could do whatever he wanted without consequence. Her steps slowed, and she instinctively tightened her grip on the strap of her bag, feeling the weight of her decision. But there was no turning back now. As Hayes approached, his eyes narrowed. He sized her up, as though deciding whether she was worth his time. "What's your business here?" His voice was low, cutting through the noise around them. Elena didn't flinch. She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "I'm just passing through," she replied, her voice steady but her pulse quickening. He smirked, and in that moment, Elena knew he had already decided who she was. A nobody. A person without significance. Someone to be dealt with. "Sure you are," Hayes muttered, taking a step closer. He looked around, ensuring no one was paying attention. "You should keep walking, sweetheart. This isn't your part of town." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Elena's body tensed. Her heart thudded harder in her chest, but she stood her ground. This wasn't the first time she had been dismissed, belittled, underestimated. It wouldn't be the last. Hayes reached out, his hand grabbing her arm with a force that made her wince. He pulled her towards him, his grip like iron. "I don't think you understand. You don't belong here." The crowd around them seemed to fade into the background, their presence no longer important. Elena's breath hitched, but she didn't let the fear show. Instead, she locked her eyes on Hayes, her gaze cold and unwavering. For a split second, Hayes hesitated. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of defiance, that made him pause, but only for a moment. He sneered, tightening his grip. "You should know your place." Her body trembled under the pressure, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. Elena knew exactly who she was, even if no one else did, and she would make sure they learned to understand. The officer's smirk widened as he moved to shove her away. But just as his hand pushed her, there was a sudden shift. The world around them seemed to tilt, as if time itself had decided to slow down. Elena's eyes locked on him, her hand still clutching the strap of her bag. She took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the fire inside her grow hotter. She had been underestimated before, and in a world that thought it could break her, she would prove just how wrong they were. The next move would be his mistake. The sound of footsteps behind them was barely audible, but Elena could feel the shift in the air. Something was coming. Something bigger. The air between them crackled with a tension so thick it was almost palpable. Elena felt her heart race, but her mind remained unnervingly calm. She had been in situations like this before. The world had always taught her that she had to keep her head down, to avoid the sharp eyes of those who believed themselves to be above others. But now, as Officer Hayes's hand gripped her arm, something inside her shifted. The simmering anger she had kept hidden for so long began to bubble to the surface, her pulse quickening with every passing second. Hayes's smirk only grew wider, his grip tightening as he pulled her further away from the street corner and into a dimly lit alley, far from the eyes of any potential witnesses. His voice was low, laced with mockery. "You think you can walk around here like you own the place?" he spat, his breath hot on her face. "This is a city for people who matter, not for the likes of you." Elena's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to show any sign of weakness. This wasn't about her. This was about all of them, all the people like her who had been pushed down for far too long. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to look directly into his eyes. "You don't own anything," she said quietly, but there was a sharpness in her voice that made him pause for just a fraction of a second. Hayes, however, wasn't about to let it go. His eyes darkened with a combination of disbelief and growing rage. "You really don't get it, do you? You don't belong here. You don't get to talk back to me. I can make your life a living hell." He yanked her closer, their faces inches apart. She could smell the stale, cheap cologne on his skin and see the veins in his neck popping with the force of his anger. "You think I can't make you disappear? You think I won't just toss you in the back of this car and take you somewhere where no one will ever find you again? No one would even care, you know. You're just another nobody." Elena's breath hitched for a moment, the weight of his words striking her harder than she expected. But then she reminded herself of something she had always known. They didn't own her. They couldn't break her, no matter how many times they tried. The fire inside her burned hotter now, stoked by the injustice she had endured her entire life. And this officer, with his racist arrogance and his belief that he was untouchable, would be no different from all the others who had tried to put her in her place. "You can't scare me," she whispered, her voice growing colder. "You think you're above me, above everyone like me, but you're not. You're just a man who hides behind a badge to make himself feel powerful. But you're not as untouchable as you think." Hayes's face twisted with rage at her words, and before she could even process it, he struck her across the face. The force of the slap made her head snap to the side, her vision momentarily blurred. The sting of the slap lingered on her cheek, but what hurt more was the way he looked at her afterward, as though she were nothing, as though she didn't matter. "You're nothing," he snarled, his voice dripping with contempt. "Just a filthy little thing, pretending like you have any worth in this world. Do you really think anyone cares about you? Do you think anyone would give a damn if I broke your bones right here and left your body to rot in some corner?" Her cheek burned, and a bitter taste rose in her throat, but Elena didn't flinch. She didn't back down. This wasn't the first time she had felt the sting of someone's cruelty. It wouldn't be the last, but she refused to let it define her. Hayes's breath was hot against her skin, his grip tightening like a vice around her arm as he shoved her roughly against the wall of the alley. She could feel the pressure of his body against hers, the weight of his disgust pushing down on her. She could feel the racial animus in every word, in every move. It wasn't just about power. It was about control. It was about his need to remind her that, in his eyes, she was nothing more than a second-class citizen. "I don't know what you're thinking," he said, his voice dripping with malice, "but I'm going to make sure you remember your place. People like you are meant to stay in the shadows, to be invisible, and I'll make sure you stay that way. You're lucky I don't throw you in jail right now." His grip on her arm was suffocating, and for a moment, Elena felt the weight of his words, of his presence, pressing in on her. It was like being trapped in a cage she couldn't escape. A cage built on racism, on hate. But deep inside, she felt the fire burning stronger, the heat of her own resolve pushing against the pressure he was putting on her. She stood her ground, feeling every inch of his contempt, but she refused to break. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, the words sharp and defiant. "And you can't scare me. You think you have power over me, but you're wrong." Hayes laughed darkly, a twisted sound that made her stomach churn. "You think you're tough. You're just a little girl. You think you can fight me, fight the system. You'll never win. People like you don't win." He leaned in closer, his face a mask of hatred and arrogance. "You'll never be anything more than what you are, just another victim of your own stupidity. And I'm going to make sure of it. You'll stay down, and you'll stay quiet, or I'll make sure you regret it." For a moment, Elena was silent, the fire inside her burning brighter with every word he spoke. She could feel the weight of the years of injustice, the racism, the crushing weight of society's disdain pressing down on her. But instead of breaking, instead of crumbling beneath it all, she let that fire grow. She let it consume her doubts, her fears, and her pain. She looked at him, her eyes cold and unflinching, and said, "You're wrong. I'm not a victim. I'm not what you think I am. You'll see. I'll make sure you see." For a moment, the officer just stared at her, his eyes narrowing with confusion and rage. But before he could react, the sound of footsteps echoed from the end of the alley, sharp and unmistakable. Hayes looked over his shoulder, and for the first time, a flicker of unease crossed his face. But Elena didn't need to see who it was. She didn't need to see anything but the look in Hayes's eyes, the way his confidence faltered for just a moment. She knew that something was coming, something bigger than both of them. Her heart raced, but now it was with anticipation, not fear. She had just made the first move in a game that would change everything. Let's take a brief pause here. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to our stories from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your life? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to subscribe and stay updated on the next chapters. Now, let's continue. The heavy air in the alley pressed against Elena's skin, the tension thick enough to choke. Hayes had just stepped back, his sneer still etched on his face, but his eyes flickered with an unexpected sense of hesitation. The footsteps from the end of the alley grew louder, but Elena knew better than to take her attention off Hayes. His arrogance was like a shield, but she had always been able to see through it. For a moment, Elena thought he might back off. Perhaps he realized the situation was changing, or maybe he was beginning to recognize that there was something about her that wouldn't be so easily crushed. Whatever the reason, for the first time since he had cornered her, Elena saw a crack in his demeanor. Hayes turned his head, his gaze darting towards the source of the approaching footsteps. But when he looked back at Elena, she saw the anger in his eyes. It wasn't just directed at her. It was directed at everyone like her. The quiet fury of a man who believed himself to be better than the world around him, someone who had never been challenged, never been made to feel small. The footsteps grew louder, and Elena couldn't help but glance toward the end of the alley. But even before she could catch a glimpse of who was approaching, she felt the shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't just the sound of someone walking, it was the sound of something bigger, something that could no longer be ignored. Then, without warning, a figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the alley, and Elena's breath caught in her throat. A man, tall and imposing, stepped into the dim light. His presence was powerful, like the calm before a storm. He wasn't like any of the officers she had seen before. He wasn't here to intimidate. He wasn't here to throw his weight around. He was here to change the game. Hayes froze. His eyes widened with recognition, and the smug expression on his face faltered. The man approaching was no ordinary figure in the police force. He was a part of something much larger, someone who could turn the tables with just a word. "Elena," the man said, his voice steady and commanding. The sound of his name on his lips was like a silent warning. Step aside. For a moment, Elena didn't move. She knew exactly who he was, the chief of police, someone who held far more power than any officer on the beat. But his presence wasn't a simple rescue. It was a complication. She had already taken a step into this war, and now it was time to make a choice. She slowly stepped aside, giving the chief room to approach. Her eyes remained locked on Hayes, watching the confusion play out in his features. "Chief," Hayes said, his voice suddenly faltering, losing the arrogance that had filled it moments before. He straightened up, but his voice lacked the usual authority it once carried. "What are you doing here?" The chief didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step closer to Elena, his eyes scanning her like a predator sizing up its prey. Though there was something different in his gaze, a flicker of recognition, a hint of something else. He didn't seem to care about Elena's bruised cheek or the tension in the air. All he cared about was the officer standing in front of him. The officer who had, in some unspoken way, crossed a line. "Elena," the chief repeated, his voice a little softer this time. "Why don't you step outside and let me handle this?" For a moment, Elena hesitated. She had come this far. She had fought every step of the way to stand her ground, to face down those who thought they could break her. But as much as she wanted to face Hayes alone, she knew this moment was bigger than just them. She nodded, stepping aside fully, her eyes never leaving Hayes. She saw the way his posture had changed, the way his confidence had deflated, as though the arrival of the chief had somehow undone everything he had worked so hard to build. The facade of power he had so carefully constructed now crumbled. But before she could make her way out of the alley, the chief turned his attention to her. "Get out of here," he muttered under his breath, but his eyes softened, and there was something almost sympathetic in the way he looked at her. As she walked past them, Elena could hear the quiet exchange between the two officers. Hayes was still trying to salvage some semblance of his former self, his words stumbling over each other in a mixture of fear and anger. Elena, however, didn't listen. She didn't care about what happened next. She didn't care about the politics or the corruption. All she cared about was moving forward. The world she had stepped into was shifting in ways she hadn't anticipated, and no matter how far she had come, she knew there was more to this battle than just the personal. She stepped back out into the crowded streets, the noise of the city rushing back to her ears. But her thoughts were elsewhere. She had learned to trust her instincts. And now, those instincts told her that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. It was just beginning. Inside the alley, Hayes was still standing rigidly as the chief took another step toward him, his voice growing colder with every word. "You think you're untouchable, Hayes?" the chief asked, his voice low but filled with authority. "You think your badge gives you the right to treat people like that? To terrorize them? To act like they don't matter?" Hayes swallowed hard, his throat tight. Chief, You're not the law here, Hayes. You're just a cog in a system that's rotten to the core, and people like Elena, they're the ones who remind us all of that," the chief interrupted. "You've crossed a line. You've made it personal. And that is something I will not stand for." The chief's eyes burned with a quiet fury as he continued. "You will face consequences. And trust me, I don't care who you think you are. I don't care about your rank, your years of service. You will answer for what you've done." Hayes opened his mouth to protest, but the words died on his tongue. The chief's gaze was unwavering, and Hayes knew that whatever the chief said next would seal his fate. Outside, Elena leaned against a lamppost, trying to steady her breath. The adrenaline from the encounter still pulsed in her veins. But there was something else now. A feeling of unease, mixed with something more. She had always been the underdog, always fighting to survive in a world that had never given her a fair chance. And yet, here she was, facing down a man who had threatened her, standing on the edge of something much bigger than she had anticipated. But Elena knew one thing: she would not be broken. Not now, Not ever. Whatever the system had in store for her, she was ready. And whatever happened next, she would be the one to take control. As the noise of the city surrounded her, she made a promise to herself. No one would keep her silent. No one would keep her in the shadows. The game had just begun. The events in the alley seemed to echo in Elena's mind long after she had left the scene. The chief's words reverberated within her, and despite the sense of victory she felt for standing up to Hayes, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made a dangerous move. The world she had entered was one of hidden power, and it was not a place for the faint-hearted. As the night fell, the neon lights of the city grew brighter, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward Elena's every step. She had always felt the weight of those shadows, silent, watching, waiting. But tonight, it was different. She had seen a crack in the system, and though she had only taken the smallest of steps, she knew that it was only a matter of time before she would be forced to move further. The chief may have intervened, but Elena knew that power wasn't about rescue. It was about control, and those who controlled the strings would never let go easily. She made her way to a small diner on the corner of a street, tucked away from the usual rush of traffic. The warm, greasy smell of fried food mixed with the cold night air as she walked in, and the bell above the door chimed softly. The diner was nearly empty, save for a couple of old men at the counter, their faces weathered with age and their eyes distant. Elena slid into a booth near the back, hoping for a moment of solitude. But even as she sat down, she knew it would be fleeting. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. The message was from an unknown number, but the name attached to it immediately caught her attention. Damon Hayes. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, uncertain if she should open it. But curiosity won out, and she tapped the message. I know who you are, and I will make sure you regret everything. You think you can stand up to me. You think you're above it all? You're just a filthy nobody, and I'll make sure you know your place. Her stomach churned, but she didn't flinch. She had expected this. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to break her spirit with words. It wouldn't be the last. She could almost hear Hayes's voice in her mind as she read the words, thick with venom, steeped in hate. His racism bled through the text in every letter, in every threat. Elena stared at the screen, her fingers trembling slightly. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to remind her of her place in the world. She had heard it all before, from the whispers of classmates when she was younger, to the sneers of strangers when she walked through certain neighborhoods. To them, she was just a woman of color, someone who had no right to aspire, no right to be seen as anything other than inferior. But Elena knew something they didn't. She was far from powerless. She had spent years learning to navigate a world that would sooner crush her than acknowledge her worth. And now, as the words from Hayes burned into her mind, she felt a fire ignite deep inside her. A fire that had been smouldering for years, waiting for the right moment to burst forth. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. This one was shorter but no less chilling. Don't forget who's in control here. You will pay for your insolence. The heat in her chest grew, and with it, a cold determination. Elena knew that these threats weren't just words. They were a declaration. Hayes wanted to remind her that in this world, people like her were meant to stay in their place. And now, he was going to make sure she learned that lesson the hard way. But Elena had no intention of being taught that lesson. She turned off her phone and slipped it back into her bag, her eyes narrowing. The diner's silence pressed in around her, but it didn't matter. The world outside had always been hostile, but it was nothing compared to what she would face now. There was no going back. She had stepped into the game, and now she would have to play by its rules. The following day, Elena woke early, the streets still wrapped in the early morning haze. The city felt quieter now, like a predator stalking its prey. She moved through the streets with purpose, her eyes sharp, alert. She couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was happening, something that she had only begun to understand. By midday, she found herself walking past the city's police precinct. The building loomed ahead, cold and imposing, a symbol of power and authority. But to Elena, it was more than that. It was a fortress built on the backs of people like her, and today it would be the place where she would begin to fight back. She entered the precinct, her heart pounding in her chest, but she kept her head high. She was no longer a victim. She was a player in a game that had been rigged against her from the start, and it was time to turn the tables. The receptionist at the front desk barely glanced up as Elena approached, her eyes flicking over Elena with the practiced indifference of someone who had seen it all before. "I need to speak with Chief Harris," Elena said, her voice steady, unwavering. The receptionist raised an eyebrow. "And why would you want to speak with him?" "I have information. Important information about Officer Hayes," Elena said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I think you'll want to hear it." The receptionist's indifference faltered for just a second. "Wait here," she said curtly, before disappearing into the back. Eleanor's heart raced as she sat down in the sterile, uncomfortable chair by the front desk. The minutes stretched on, each one dragging her deeper into the waiting game. But she didn't care. She had made her choice, and there was no going back now. When Chief Harris finally appeared, he looked as though he had just been pulled from his office in the middle of something important. His greying hair was dishevelled, and there was a tiredness in his eyes. But his presence was commanding, and Elena stood as soon as she saw him approach. "Miss—" He glanced at her, his gaze hardening. "Elena," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I have information that you need to hear about Officer Hayes." Harris studied her for a moment, his eyes flicking over her face. There was something calculating in his gaze, something that made Elena feel as though he was already weighing her worth. "Information?" he repeated. "What kind of information?" "I know what he's been doing," Elena said, her voice dropping lower. "I know the kind of man he is, and I have proof that can bring him down." Harris didn't react immediately. He only stared at her, his lips pressed tightly together. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. "Come with me," he said, his voice tight. "We'll talk in my office." As they walked through the precinct, Elena couldn't help but notice the way the officers looked at her. The stares, the subtle glances. She knew what they saw. A woman trying to bring down one of their own. To them, she wasn't a person. She was an obstacle, a problem to be dealt with. She followed Harris into his office, the door closing behind them with a soft thud. The room was cluttered, papers stacked on every available surface. Harris motioned for her to sit, and she did so without hesitation. "I'm listening," he said, his voice measured. Elena took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what she was about to say. "Officer Hayes has been abusing his power. I've been a victim of it myself, and I know he's done it to others. He's been using his badge to intimidate, harass, and even hurt people like me. People who don't have the power to fight back." Harris leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I'm aware of the allegations against him," he said slowly. "But you must understand, Elena, this is a delicate matter. Hayes is a seasoned officer. He has connections. His influence runs deep." "I don't care about his connections," Elena said, her voice hardening. "What matters is what's right. What matters is stopping him before he destroys more lives, before he does this to someone else." Harris was silent for a moment, his gaze flicking to the stack of papers on his desk. He was weighing his options, calculating his next move. Elena could feel the tension in the room growing heavier, but she didn't back down. This was her moment, and she wouldn't let it slip away. "I'll look into it," Harris said finally, his tone colder than before. "But you need to understand something, Elena. This won't be easy, and it won't be clean." "I'm not looking for easy or clean," Elena replied. "I'm looking for justice." For the first time, Harris gave her a sharp nod. "Then we're in the same fight." As Elena left the precinct, the world outside felt different. The fight was far from over, but she had made a significant move. She had stepped into a world where power was wielded by the few, where corruption ran deep, and where the system itself was designed to protect those who abused it. But Elena wasn't afraid. She had nothing left to lose, and in a world that had tried to silence her, she was finally ready to make her voice heard. The game had truly begun. The days following her meeting with Chief Harris were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Elena had taken a risk, one that would change the course of her life forever. The power dynamics she had begun to understand were like a web, and now she was in the center of it. The very system she had always felt alienated from was now something she was trying to manipulate, control, and expose for the corruption it hid beneath its polished surface. But the closer she came to unraveling it, the more dangerous the game became. She spent the following days trying to stay out of the spotlight, watching for any signs that Hayes was retaliating. But the silence was deafening. She expected threats, violence, or at the very least some sort of intimidation. Yet there was nothing. Elena couldn't help but wonder if she was just a pawn in a much bigger game. She had made herself a target, but it seemed like someone, perhaps Hayes himself, was waiting for the right moment to strike. In the meantime, she worked to gather her evidence, every piece carefully tucked away in her apartment where no one could find it. Files, photographs, recordings, proof of the abuse and corruption that had gone unchecked for years. It was only a matter of time before she had enough to bring everything crashing down. But until then, every moment felt like a risk. One afternoon, as Elena walked through a more secluded area of the city, the weight of the silence was broken by the sound of approaching footsteps. She turned, her heart skipping a beat, but the face that greeted her was not one she had expected. A man in his mid-40s stood before her. His appearance was sharp, his dark suit a stark contrast to the gritty surroundings of the alley. He had an air of authority, someone who seemed to have stepped out of the shadows with a purpose. Elena didn't recognize him, but there was something unsettling about the way he looked at her. His eyes were calculating, assessing her like a piece of meat at a butcher's counter. "Elena," he said, his voice smooth, almost too calm. "I've heard a lot about you. You've been making quite a name for yourself." Her stomach tightened. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady, but her instincts screaming that this wasn't a simple encounter. The man smirked. "Let's just say I'm someone who has an interest in the people who like to upset the status quo." He stepped closer, and Elena instinctively took a step back, her gaze flicking to the alley's entrance as though seeking an escape route. "Is that a threat?" Elena asked, though she already knew the answer. She had heard the tone before, the arrogant, dismissive undertone of someone who thought they could break her with nothing more than words. "Consider it a warning," he said smoothly. "You're stirring up trouble in places you don't belong. People like you, people who think they can change things, well, they don't last long." "People like me," Elena repeated, narrowing her eyes. "What? Because I'm a woman? Or because I'm not afraid of you?" He laughed softly, the sound condescending. "It's because you're nothing but an annoyance. You're someone who thinks she's special, that she has the right to challenge the system. But let me tell you something. This city isn't built for people like you. It's built for people like Hayes." His words were like a slap to the face, and Elena couldn't help but feel a surge of anger rise within her. She had already stood up to Hayes once. She would do it again. She wasn't afraid. "You think I'm just going to fall in line because you say so?" Elena said, her voice tight with restraint. The man's smirk grew wider, his eyes gleaming with something darker. "I don't need to make you fall in line. That's what people like Hayes are for. He knows how to keep people like you in check." He stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. "You'll never win. No matter how many files you have, no matter what evidence you think you've gathered, you're just a pawn in this game, and you're about to get played." Elena's heart raced, but she stood firm. "I'm not afraid of you or anyone else who thinks they control this city," she said, her tone defiant. "I'm going to bring Hayes down, and I'm going to expose everything you're all hiding." The man looked at her as if she were a child spouting foolish dreams. You have no idea what you're up against, he said. But keep playing your little game. You'll see. The system will remind you of your place soon enough. Without another word, the man turned and walked away, leaving Elena standing in the alley, seething with anger. But there was something more that gnawed at her. Fear. Not for herself, but for the people she was trying to protect. If they were willing to send someone like him after her, what lengths would they go to in order to silence her? The following days were filled with tension. Elena could feel the walls closing in around her, the threat of retaliation lingering in the air like smoke. She continued to gather more evidence, but every time she thought she was getting closer, something else seemed to push her back. It wasn't just Hayes now. There were others involved, people she hadn't even begun to uncover. The deeper she went, the more dangerous the waters became. One evening, as Elena sat in her apartment, scrolling through her files, a loud knock at her door startled her. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her heart skipped a beat, and she glanced around her apartment, her mind racing. It could be anyone, someone trying to intimidate her, someone trying to steal her evidence. She hesitated, but the knocking grew more insistent, almost frantic. She stood up, walked slowly to the door, and peered through the peephole. What she saw made her heart race. It was Officer Hayes, standing on the other side. His face was flushed, his eyes wild with anger. "Elena," he said, his voice muffled through the door. "I know what you're doing. I know you've been gathering information on me. And I'm going to make sure you regret it." Elena felt a chill run down her spine, but she didn't open the door. Instead, she moved away, her mind racing. She had expected something like this, but hearing him say it out loud made the threat feel real. Her first instinct was to call the police, but she knew that would be useless. Hayes was the police, and anyone who had ties to him would never believe her. She needed to find another way. She needed to keep her composure, stay focused on the bigger picture. But she couldn't help the panic that was rising inside her. The man who had hurt her, who had threatened to break her, was standing on the other side of that door, and he was going to do everything in his power to make sure she didn't succeed. The days that followed were a blur of paranoia and fear. Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She felt eyes on her wherever she went, whispers in the crowd, a car parked too long on the street. The world she had stepped into was closing in around her, and she was starting to realize that it wasn't just Hayes who wanted to take her down. There were far more dangerous forces at play here. It became clear to Elena that the game she had entered was no longer just about Hayes. It was about something much bigger, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to face it. But there was no turning back now. The stakes had been raised, and no matter how hard they tried to silence her, Elena was determined to make her voice heard. No one would break her. No one would keep her down. She would expose the corruption, no matter what the cost. The price of power was steep, but Elena was willing to pay it. The days stretched on, each one heavier than the last. Elena could feel the weight of everything bearing down on her. Every decision she made seemed to bring her one step closer to the point of no return. The threats from Hayes had grown more frequent, his presence more suffocating. And yet, the silence from Chief Harris left her on edge, unsure whether the promise of his support was genuine or just another way to keep her in line. The city, with its sprawling streets and endless alleys, felt more like a cage than ever before, and Elena was trapped inside it. But it wasn't just Hayes anymore. She had caught the attention of people much higher up the chain, and with every step she took toward exposing the corruption she had uncovered, the danger became more tangible. Elena had come to understand something she hadn't fully realized before. Power doesn't just corrupt, it crushes, twists, and distorts everything it touches. And when you challenge it, it fights back with every weapon at its disposal. Elena had spent the last few days laying low, trying to keep her head down and stay out of sight. She had made contact with a few journalists who were willing to help expose the truth, but every step was fraught with risks. There were too many eyes watching her, too many people who would stop at nothing to bury her efforts. She couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in, that the noose around her neck was slowly tightening. It was early one evening when the next blow came. Elena had just returned from a meeting with a reporter when she noticed a car parked across the street from her building. The headlights were off, but the engine was running. It was a black SUV, its windows tinted so dark that she couldn't see inside. She felt a chill run down her spine. There was no doubt in her mind now. Someone was watching her. She had expected it, but the reality of it still hit her like a punch to the gut. Her first instinct was to retreat back into the safety of her apartment. But she couldn't. She had come too far. The stakes were too high. If she backed down now, everything she had fought for would be for nothing. So, instead of hiding, Elena did the only thing she could do. She kept walking. She walked straight past the car, her pace quickening as she approached the entrance to her building. She had barely reached the door when she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned quickly, her heart racing, but it was too late. A hand gripped her arm, pulling her back into the darkness of the alley beside her building. "Where do you think you're going?" a low voice growled, sending a shock of fear through her body. It was Hayes. She tried to pull away, but his grip was ironclad. "Let go of me," she spat, struggling to free herself. His eyes glinted with malice as he stepped closer, his breath hot against her face. "You've been a thorn in my side for far too long, Elena," he sneered. "You thought you could just waltz in here and destroy everything I've built? Think again." Elena's pulse hammered in her chest, but she refused to show fear. "You're nothing," she said, her voice steady, despite the anger that boiled within her. "You've been abusing your power, terrorizing people, thinking you can do whatever you want because of your badge. But it's over now. I'm not backing down." Hayes' laugh was cold and devoid of humor. "You don't know how deep this goes, do you?" His grip on her arm tightened as he forced her to look up at him. "This isn't just about me. This is about the people who run things. The ones who control this city. The ones who will make sure you never get to finish what you started." His words hit her like a ton of bricks. She had known there were powerful people behind him, but hearing it from him directly made the threat feel even more real. He wasn't just a corrupt cop. He was a part of a larger machine, and the machine didn't tolerate disobedience. Elena refused to show any sign of weakness. "I don't care who you think you are," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm not afraid of you. You can try to break me, but I'll keep going. I'll expose you. I'll expose all of you." His expression darkened, and for a moment, she saw something in his eyes, something that made her stomach turn. It was hatred, pure and raw. He was a man who had spent years living above the law, getting away with whatever he wanted, and now someone was daring to bring it all crashing down. "You think this is a game?" Hayes hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can just waltz in here and start playing by your own rules? You're nothing, Elena. You're a nobody. And when I'm done with you, no one will ever remember your name." The words stung, but Elena didn't flinch. She knew what he was trying to do. He was trying to break her, to make her doubt herself, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. She was stronger than he realized, stronger than they all realized. "Maybe I'm a nobody," she said, her voice cold. "But I'm still somebody who's going to make sure you pay for what you've done." With that, she wrenched her arm free and turned, walking briskly into the building. She could feel Hayes' eyes on her as she entered, the weight of his stare following her every step. But she refused to let it affect her. She had made it this far, and she wasn't going to let him or anyone else stop her now. But that night, as Elena lay in bed, trying to process everything that had just happened, the reality of the situation began to sink in. She had known it wouldn't be easy, but the depth of the danger she was in was becoming clearer by the day. Hayes wasn't just a cop trying to protect his own reputation. He was a part of something much bigger, something that controlled every aspect of the city, from the streets to the police force to the politicians in office. And now he was going to do whatever it took to stop her. But Elena couldn't back down. She had to keep pushing forward, no matter how dark things seemed. She had the evidence, she had the truth, and now she just had to find a way to expose it to the world. The next morning, Elena received another message, but this one wasn't from Hayes. The name on the screen made her stomach drop. Chief Harris. We need to talk. Now. The message was short, but the urgency was clear. Elena had no idea what was going on, but something told her that this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. She quickly gathered her things and headed to the precinct, her mind racing with questions. What did Harris want? Was he about to turn on her, just like everyone else? Or was he finally ready to take action? When she arrived at the precinct, she was ushered into Harris's office without delay. The chief was sitting at his desk, his face grim, his eyes shadowed with worry. "Sit down," he said, his voice low and tense. Elena took a seat across from him, her heart pounding in her chest. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Harris leaned forward, his fingers steepled together. "I've been looking into Hayes, Elena, and I'm afraid I've uncovered something that could put us all at risk." Her pulse quickened. "What do you mean? What have you found?" Harris hesitated before speaking. "Hayes isn't just corrupt. He's working with people who have connections to organized crime, to the very people who control this city. He's been using his position to cover up illegal activities, trafficking, money laundering, everything, and it goes way beyond him. There are others involved, high-ranking officers, politicians, businessmen. It's all connected." Elena's mind reeled. She had suspected something big, but hearing it from Harris made it all too real. She was in the middle of something much larger than she had ever imagined. And now, the stakes had risen beyond her own safety. She was standing on the edge of a conspiracy that could bring down the entire city, and no one would stop until she was silenced. "I've been trying to get the evidence to take it all down," Harris continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But they're watching me too, and they know you're getting close. You're in danger, Elena. If you don't get out of this, they'll come after you next." Elena's heart pounded in her chest. She knew it was true. She had felt the threat closing in on her for days now. But she couldn't run. Not now. Not when she was this close. "I'm not backing down," Elena said, her voice filled with resolve. "I've come too far. I'll bring them all down, no matter what it takes." Harris looked at her, his expression one of both concern and admiration. "I can't promise you safety, Elena, but I can promise you this. I'll do everything in my power to help you, but you have to be careful. The people you're dealing with are ruthless." Elena stood up, her resolve steeled. "I've always been careful, but I won't stop. Not now." She turned and walked out of the office, her mind racing. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to stop now. She would expose them all, and nothing, no threat, no fear, would make her back down. The game was no longer just about survival. It was about justice, and Elena was ready to make them pay. The night had grown colder, the sharp wind slicing through the streets like an omen. Elena stood on the edge of the city's quiet district, her mind reeling. Every conversation, every threat, every new piece of evidence she gathered had brought her closer to the truth. But the deeper she dug, the more perilous the road ahead became. The stakes had escalated beyond anything she had prepared for, and as much as she wanted to back away, she knew she couldn't. Not now. Not when everything she had worked for was within her grasp. Chief Harris had promised his help, but Elena wasn't naive. She knew that trusting him fully came with its own risks. Harris was part of the system, the very system she was trying to bring down. Could she trust him? Or was he just another cog in the machine, trying to salvage what was left of his own reputation before the storm hit? She didn't know, and the uncertainty gnawed at her, but she couldn't afford to question her allies now. Not when Hayes, the corrupt officer who had tormented her, was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The people who ran this city, the ones who believed themselves to be untouchable, needed to be exposed. She needed to show the world just how deep the corruption ran. But as the days wore on, Elena couldn't ignore the feeling that she was being watched. The shadow of danger had followed her every step, but now it seemed closer than ever. She had to move quickly. Every passing hour brought her closer to being discovered, to having everything she'd worked for ripped from her hands. It was late one night when the phone rang. Elena froze, her fingers trembling as she picked it up. "Elena, it's Harris," came the voice on the other end, sounding strained. "You need to come to the precinct. It's urgent. Now." Elena's stomach dropped. The urgency in his voice was enough to send her heart racing. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Just get here. I'll explain everything when you arrive. And be careful. Hayes knows you're getting close. You're in danger. They're starting to close in." The line went dead before Elena could respond. She stood still for a moment, processing the gravity of his words. Hayes, the people behind him, the system she had been fighting to expose. They were all onto her now, and the walls were closing in fast. By the time Elena arrived at the precinct, the cold night air had already seeped into her bones. She could feel the weight of her every step as she entered the building. The fluorescent lights above buzzed like the hum of an ominous warning. It felt different now. The building, once just a place of law and order, now seemed like the heart of a machine that ran on fear and corruption. Harris was waiting for her in his office, his usual composed demeanor replaced by something far more serious. He looked up as she entered, his eyes scanning the room, checking for anything out of place. "Close the door," Harris said, his voice low. "We need to talk." Elena did as instructed, her pulse quickening. Something was off, and she could feel the tension in the air. "Hayes isn't just an officer anymore," Harris began, his voice laced with frustration. "He's become a part of something much bigger. The corruption goes all the way to the top of the department. And now the people he's working with, they have eyes everywhere. They're watching you. They're watching me." "Who are they?" Elena asked, leaning forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "Who's behind all of this?" Harris hesitated, running a hand through his greying hair. "You don't understand, Elena. These people are untouchable. They've been running things in this city for years. Politicians, business tycoons, law enforcement, none of them are clean. Hayes has been working for them all this time. They know everything, and they're not going to let you expose them." A cold shiver ran down Elena's spine. "So what? They're going to kill me?" she asked, the words bitter on her tongue. Harris looked at her, his eyes dark with regret. "They'll do worse than that. They'll make you disappear, and no one will ever know what happened to you." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. But Elena didn't flinch. She wasn't going to let fear control her now. She had made it this far. She couldn't stop now. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the storm raging inside her. Harris stood up, walking over to the window and staring out at the city below. "We need to take them down, but it won't be easy. Hayes and his people have the power to destroy us if we don't move carefully." Elena took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I don't care how hard it is. I'm not backing down. We've come too far." Harris turned to face her, his eyes filled with something, admiration. Or perhaps it was just the acknowledgement of the fight ahead. "You're brave, Elena, but don't be naive. This is bigger than both of us, and they're going to make you pay for it." "Let them try," Elena said, her voice unwavering. "I'm ready." Later that night, as Elena walked out of the precinct, she felt the weight of everything crashing down on her. The decision she had made was irreversible. She had decided to fight, and now there was no turning back. The system that had silenced so many before her was going to hear her voice, and nothing would stop her. But as she turned the corner toward her apartment, a cold voice called out from the shadows. "You should have stayed out of this." Elena's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the voice instantly. It was Hayes. She spun around to face him, her fists clenched, her body tensed for the fight that was surely coming. Hayes stepped into the dim light, his uniform still crisp, his face twisted with the arrogance that had made him a tyrant in this city. But now his expression was darker, more menacing than she had ever seen before. "I warned you, Elena," Hayes sneered, stepping closer. "You're playing a game you don't understand. And now you're going to pay for it." Elena stood her ground. "I'm not afraid of you, Hayes. You think you can intimidate me. You think I'm just going to fold under pressure. I've been through worse." Hayes chuckled darkly, the sound almost pitying. "You don't get it, do you? You've already lost. Your little fight against the system, it's over. You're nothing, just another pawn in a game that you can't win." He reached out, grabbing her by the arm, and this time Elena didn't resist. She let him pull her close, her face inches from his. "You're nothing but a filthy little problem," he hissed, his breath hot and foul. "And I'm going to make sure you know your place." Elena's eyes flashed with fury, her jaw set in defiance. "You'll never break me," she said through gritted teeth. "You'll never silence me." For a moment, Hayes just stared at her, as if trying to gauge whether her words were sincere. Then, his expression twisted into something far more cruel. "I don't need to break you," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I just need to make sure you don't matter." With that, Hayes shoved her away, sending her stumbling back into the cold, unforgiving night. Elena caught herself before hitting the ground, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The words stung more than she cared to admit, but they didn't have the power to defeat her. Hayes thought he could intimidate her, but he didn't understand what she was capable of. As she straightened up, Elena's resolve hardened. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't backing down. Hayes and his allies might think they controlled the city, but they were wrong. They would all learn the hard way that Elena was far more than a threat. They were the ones who should be afraid. The storm was coming, and Elena was ready to face it head-on. The game was far from over. Elena's blood was still simmering with anger as she walked away from Hayes, her steps purposeful and steady. The chilling words he had thrown at her echoed in her mind, but they were no longer the threats they had been when she first heard them. Instead, they felt like a spark, one that ignited something deeper inside her. Fear had no place in this fight. It never had. She was no longer the girl who cowered beneath the weight of the world. Now, she was a woman who had uncovered a truth too dangerous to ignore. And the people who thought they could control her, control everyone, would soon realize that they had made the mistake of underestimating her. The cold night air bit at her skin as she made her way back to her apartment. Each step a reminder of how far she had come and how much further she had to go. Hayes may have threatened her, but he didn't understand the gravity of the situation. She had already made up her mind. She wasn't just going to expose the system. She was going to destroy it, piece by piece. And no one, not Hayes, not the corrupt officers, not the politicians who had their fingers in every pot, could stop her. The next morning, Elena sat in her apartment, a pile of files scattered across the table before her. Her fingers brushed over the photographs, the documents, the recordings, everything she had gathered over the past few weeks. She had spent hours, days, collecting these pieces, building a case that could bring the entire city to its knees. But now she realized something crucial. She couldn't do this alone. She had already reached out to a few trusted journalists, but it wasn't enough. If she was going to take down Hayes and the people behind him, she needed allies who had as much to lose as she did. People who had seen the corruption firsthand. There was only one place Elena could go now. She arrived at the old diner at the edge of town, just as the sun began to set. The neon sign flickered as she walked inside, the familiar smell of coffee and greasy food filling the air. The place was empty, save for a few patrons scattered across the booths, their faces worn with age and hardship. Elena approached the counter, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been here before, but this time was different. This time, She was asking for something far more dangerous than a cup of coffee. Behind the counter, an older man with graying hair and tired eyes looked up at her. His name was Marcus, and he had been the kind of man who had seen the worst of the city and survived. He had helped her once before, when she first started investigating Hayes's connections, and now she was back, hoping he could help again. "You came," Marcus said, his voice gravelly but warm, as if he knew why she was here. "I figured you would." Elena nodded, sliding into one of the stools at the counter. "I need your help," she said, her voice low but firm. "I've got something big, but I can't do it alone. I need people I can trust." Marcus studied her for a moment, his eyes sharp despite his age. "You know this isn't going to be easy, right? You're asking me to stick my neck out, and I've been through this before. I've seen what happens when people try to take down the system. They don't last long." Elena's gaze never wavered. "I'm not backing down, Marcus. I've seen too much. I've heard too much. I know what Hayes and the others are doing to this city, and I can't just walk away. But I can't do it alone. Not anymore." Marcus sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. "I don't know how you've lasted this long without getting caught. But if you're serious about this, you're going to need more than just information. You'll need a plan. You'll need people on the inside who aren't afraid to go up against Hayes and the others." "I have some people in mind," Elena said, leaning in closer. "But I need someone who knows how to navigate the system, someone who's been there." Marcus leaned back, his eyes distant as he thought. For a moment, Elena thought he might refuse, but then slowly, he nodded. "I know a guy, an old friend of mine. He's a good cop, and he's been on the inside for years. He's not happy with what's going on, but he's been too scared to speak out. Maybe he'll be willing to help. But I can't promise anything." Elena's heart raced. This was the break she needed. "I'll take whatever help I can get," she said, standing up. "Where can I find him?" The next day, Elena met Marcus's contact at a small bar on the outskirts of town. The man, whose name was Tony, looked every bit the part of someone who had spent years in the shadows of the system. His face was weathered, his eyes hard, but there was a weariness to him that Elena recognized. He had seen too much, and now he was just trying to survive. "Marcus told me you're looking for help," Tony said as he slid into the booth across from Elena. "I've been keeping my head down for a long time, but if you've got something real, something that can take down Hayes and the people he's working with, I'm listening." Elena didn't waste any time. She slid a folder across the table, filled with everything she had gathered: photos, recordings, documents. "I have everything you need to bring them down. I just need people who can get the word out, who can move things behind the scenes." Tony glanced at the folder, his brow furrowing as he flipped through the papers. He was quiet for a long time, absorbing the weight of what Elena was asking him to do. Finally, he looked up at her. "This is bigger than anything I've ever seen," he said quietly. "Hayes and his crew, they've got everyone on their payroll. If you expose this, it's not just their jobs on the line, it's their freedom, and they'll do anything to protect that." "I know," Elena said, her voice resolute, "but I can't stand by and do nothing. These people, Hayes, the officers, the politicians, they've been hurting this city for far too long. It's time for them to pay." Tony nodded slowly. "All right, I'm in. But you've got to understand, this won't be easy. Hayes won't go down without a fight, and when he strikes back, it'll be brutal." "I'm ready," Elena said, her eyes burning with determination. "We have to be. There's no turning back now." The following weeks were a whirlwind of action. Tony helped Elena connect with people on the inside, officers who had grown disillusioned with the system and were ready to do whatever it took to take it down. They were scattered, living in the shadows, afraid of being discovered, but together they formed a network, a web of resistance. They couldn't be seen, couldn't be heard, but they were there, working behind the scenes to bring down Hayes and his powerful allies. But Elena knew it wasn't enough. She needed to do more. She had the evidence, But she needed the world to see it. She needed the public to demand justice, to force the authorities to act. She contacted a journalist who had been following the corruption in the city for years, someone who had long been dismissed by the mainstream media as a conspiracy theorist. His name was Lucas, and he was exactly what Elena needed. His work had exposed the shadows of the city, but it had never been enough to topple the system. Now, Elena was going to give him the final pieces of the puzzle. The night they released the story, Elena watched from a distance as the first trickles of chaos began to ripple through the city. News outlets were picking up the story, spreading it like wildfire. The people who had long been silenced, victims of corruption, fear, and abuse, were finally speaking out, emboldened by the truth that was finally coming to light. But Elena knew that this was just the beginning. Hayes and his allies weren't going to let this go without a fight. They would come for her, for Tony, for anyone who had helped expose their dirty secrets. Elena could already feel the pressure building, the threat of retaliation looming closer. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She had made her choice, and she would see it through, no matter the cost. The storm was coming, and Elena was ready to face it. The city had begun to wake up. The storm Elena had unleashed was already rippling through the streets, the tremors of her actions shaking the very foundations of the corrupt system that had ruled for so long. News outlets were buzzing. The story she and her allies had carefully crafted now in the hands of millions. The truth was out there. Irrefutable, damning, impossible to ignore. The people who had long been hidden in the shadows were finally seeing their faces in the light. But while the city stirred with the energy of change, Elena knew it was only the beginning. The fight was far from over. She stood by her window, watching as the first rays of dawn broke over the skyline. The world outside was quieter than usual, the calm before the inevitable storm. Elena had done what she set out to do, expose the darkness. But the darkness wasn't going to go away quietly. She had made powerful enemies, enemies who would stop at nothing to ensure their survival. The phone rang, jolting her from her thoughts. She picked it up without hesitation, already knowing who it was. Elena! The voice on the other end was calm, too calm. It was Marcus. They're coming for you. Hayes and the others, they know everything. They're making their move. You need to get out of there. Elena's heart skipped a beat, but she remained composed. How soon? Tonight, Marcus replied, his voice tinged with urgency. They're closing in. I don't know how long you have, but you need to get out. I've got a place for you, somewhere safe. You can lay low until we figure out the next move. But if you don't leave now, they'll find you. And once they do, it's over. The finality in his voice made her stomach twist, but she wasn't afraid. She couldn't afford to be. I'm not running, not now. Not when I'm this close. Marcus sighed heavily on the other end. Elena, don't be stupid. You've already done enough. You've exposed them. That's what matters. Let the system handle it from here. The system? Elena scoffed, her voice bitter. The system is broken. You know as well as I do that they'll cover it all up. Hayes and his cronies will spin this into nothing. They'll destroy anyone who stands in their way. There was a long pause before Marcus spoke again. I can't stop you. I know you, Elena. But don't think for a second that this won't cost you everything. You're in deeper than you realize. I'm in this until the end, Marcus, she said, her voice resolute. I won't be silenced. That night, Elena moved quickly, her every step calculated, deliberate. She knew the risks, knew that the people she had exposed were going to retaliate, but she wasn't backing down. Not now, not when she had come so far. As she walked through the city, the shadows seemed to follow her. The streets that were once familiar now felt foreign, like she was moving through a world that no longer cared for her. The hum of the city felt suffocating, and every corner she turned seemed to grow darker. Elena kept her head down, blending into the crowd, doing her best to stay invisible. She couldn't afford to attract attention. Not now. Not when Hayes was surely looking for her. She arrived at the old warehouse, the place Marcus had told her to go. It was a dilapidated building on the edge of town, far from the city's center, the kind of place people like her ended up when they were running from the law. But Elena wasn't running. She was hiding, gathering her strength, preparing for the next phase of the battle. Marcus was already there, waiting for her. His face was grim, eyes shadowed with concern. "They're close," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been hearing whispers, Elena. People are talking. Hayes is making his move and he's got connections everywhere. He won't stop until you're destroyed." Elena nodded, her jaw clenched in determination. "Then I'll destroy him first." And the hours passed slowly. As night turned to early morning, Elena sat in the dimly lit corner of the warehouse, her mind racing. She was used to the pressure, used to the fear that gnawed at her insides. But this was different. The stakes were higher than they had ever been before. Hayes and his people were powerful, ruthless, and they weren't going to stop just because Elena had exposed them. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a text message from Tony, one of the few allies she had left on the inside. "They're after you. I don't know how long you can stay hidden. Hayes is pushing hard. I'm doing what I can, but be careful." The weight of his words settled heavily on her shoulders. She couldn't afford to wait much longer. The longer she stayed hidden, the more time Hayes had to erase the evidence, to bury everything she had fought so hard to expose. She stood up, her movements deliberate, her mind focused. "We're going back in," she said, her voice low, but resolute. Marcus looked at her, disbelief in his eyes. "You're not listening. They'll kill you if they find you." "I'm not hiding anymore," Elena replied, her eyes hard. "This fight isn't just about me anymore. It's about everything I've lost, about everyone who's been silenced for far too long. I won't let them win." It was nearly impossible to predict the next move, but Elena knew it was time. She couldn't keep playing by their rules. If Hayes and his people were going to keep pushing, she was going to push back harder. They had underestimated her from the start. They thought they could break her, destroy her, bury her. But they hadn't counted on one thing: Elena's will to survive. The city was changing, and Elena was at the heart of it. The walls were closing in on Hayes, and she had every intention of being there when they came crashing down. A few days later, Elena sat in a cramped office, her eyes glued to the screen in front of her. The evidence was all there. Everything she had worked for, everything she had risked. She had spent the past few days contacting more of her inside sources, gathering every shred of information, every detail that could bring down the corrupt empire Hayes had built. As she scrolled through the files, a thought gnawed at her. She knew she couldn't take down Hayes alone. It was too big now. She needed to spread the word, to let the world know just how deep the corruption ran. But she also knew that in doing so, she was opening herself up to more danger. And then the phone rang again. "Elena!" Tony's voice was tight with panic. "You've got to move, now. Hayes is coming for you. They're on their way. You don't have much time." The words hit her like a punch. Her heart skipped a beat as she grabbed her coat, rushing out the door. But just as she stepped into the hallway, she stopped. For a moment she stood still, staring at the wall, hearing only the sound of her own breath. This was it, the moment she had been dreading and anticipating all at once. She wasn't going to run anymore. She wasn't going to hide. She was going to end this, once and for all. As she made her way to the meeting point, her thoughts were clear, focused. Hayes was coming for her. He was going to try to bury her, but this time she was ready. She had the truth, she had the power, and she had the will to fight. The night was dark and silent, the city holding its breath. Elena was about to make the world exhale. The reckoning was upon them. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as Elena stood in front of the towering glass building, the symbol of everything she had spent her life fighting against. The city sprawled beneath her, sprawling, cold, and indifferent. The streets below were filled with people, but they were unaware of the battle that had been raging in the shadows for months, a battle that had started with a single act of defiance, a whisper of truth against the power of the corrupt few. And now, standing on the precipice of it all, Elena felt the weight of everything she had endured, everything she had lost, and everything that was yet to come. The storm was coming to a head. She had exposed the rot that lay at the heart of the city, but Hayes and his network were still powerful, too powerful. Despite everything she had revealed, despite the stories that had flooded the media, the city still clung to the lie. The system was designed to protect those in power, and no amount of evidence could change that. Yet Elena knew something else now. No matter how deep the corruption ran, no matter how many they tried to silence, the truth had its way of getting out. Tonight, Elena would force the system to face it. And the plan was simple, but dangerous. She had been gathering allies for weeks now. People from every corner of the city who had been victims of the system. Police officers, activists, journalists, people who had been pushed to the margins. All of them were now standing together, ready to take a stand. The pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, and Elena was the key. But she couldn't do it alone. Marcus, Tony, even Lucas, they were all there, working in the background, helping her bring the story to the world. The world had been watching, waiting for someone to break the silence. And now Elena was the one who would make them listen. The meeting point was a small, dimly lit conference room hidden in the back of a rundown building. Elena was alone when she entered, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had expected to feel a sense of fear, but instead, there was something else inside her. It was determination, and a cold, burning rage. Rage at the system that had taken so much from her. Rage at the people who had built their empires on the backs of others, who had crushed anyone who dared to challenge them. The door behind her creaked open, and Marcus stepped inside. He looked tired, older somehow, as if the weight of everything they had gone through had taken its toll. But there was a fire in his eyes, a fire that matched her own. He knew what was at stake, and he wasn't going to let it slip away now. "You ready for this?" he asked, his voice low, steady. Elena nodded. "This is it. We do this tonight, or we lose everything." Marcus didn't reply immediately, his gaze flickering toward the window, where the lights of the city glimmered in the distance. "I never thought I'd see the day when someone would stand up like this, but you're different, Elena." She met his gaze, her face hardening. "I'm not different. I'm just tired of being pushed down, tired of letting people like Hayes think they can control me. Control anyone." Marcus gave her a thin smile. "You've got the fire, that's for sure. Just don't forget, no matter how this goes, you've already made a difference. You've already shown the world the truth." Elena took a deep breath, steadying herself. "The truth is only as strong as the people who fight for it, and right now, I'm ready to make them see." As they moved to set their plan in motion, the team was buzzing with activity. Tony was on the ground, making sure the streets were clear and everyone was in position. Lucas was finalizing the broadcast, ready to stream the evidence to the world. The media, despite their silence for so long, were now picking up on the cracks in the system, and they were ready to take action. It wasn't going to be easy, but nothing worth fighting for ever was. Elena stood in front of a small podium, her hands gripping the sides as she prepared to speak to the world. The broadcast would go live in minutes. She felt a cold sweat drip down the back of her neck, but she steadied herself. She was about to expose everything: the people who had protected Hayes, the system that had kept him in power, the lives that had been destroyed in the process. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up, and there he was. Lucas, his face pale but determined. "They're here," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "Hayes and his crew. They're on their way." Elena felt a knot form in her stomach, but she didn't flinch. "Let them come. We're not backing down now." Lucas hesitated for a moment, then nodded, turning to make sure the team was in place. Elena's mind raced, but she refused to let fear take hold. She was already too far into this, too deep into the fight. There was no turning back. The clock ticked down, and the screen in front of Elena flickered to life. The broadcast began, and she knew that, at that moment, there was no going back. The truth was about to be laid bare for everyone to see. The room fell silent as the first clip rolled, a video of Hayes in his office, speaking to one of his associates about silencing witnesses, about covering up crimes. Elena felt her chest tighten as the evidence flooded the screen. But it wasn't just about Hayes. It was about everything. The politicians, the business leaders, the officers who had let him get away with everything. The world needed to see it all. The people who had been living in fear for so long needed to hear their voices. Just as the broadcast reached its peak, the door to the room burst open. Two men entered, their faces hard, their eyes cold with menace. Hayes and one of his associates stepped into the room, their presence filling the space with a palpable tension. Elena didn't flinch. She had known this moment was coming. Hayes stepped forward, his eyes locked on hers. "You think you can expose me? You think you can take down everything I've built?" He spat, his voice thick with disdain. Elena stood tall, her gaze unwavering. "I don't need to take down your empire, Hayes. I just need to make sure the truth gets out. The world is going to know what you've done. The people you've crushed won't be silenced anymore." Hayes's face twisted with rage, his hand reaching for the gun holstered at his waist. But before he could make a move, Tony, who had been waiting outside, burst through the door with a team of officers who had finally had enough. They stormed in, securing the room, taking control. "We're done running, Hayes," Tony said, his voice calm but fierce. "The truth is out, and now you're the one who's going down." Elena felt a rush of relief, but it was short-lived. There was still work to be done. There were still people in the system who had to be brought to justice. But this was a start. This was the beginning of the end for the empire Hayes had built. As the officers took Hayes into custody, Elena walked over to the window, looking out at the city she had fought so hard to change. The storm wasn't over. The battle for justice was far from finished. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had done it. She had exposed the corruption. She had brought down one of the most dangerous men in the city, and she wasn't going to stop until every last piece of the system that had allowed men like him to thrive came crashing down. But for now, the truth had won. And in that moment, Elena knew that it wasn't just her victory. It was the victory of everyone who had ever been silenced, everyone who had ever been crushed beneath the weight of the system. Tonight, the city had taken its first real step toward change, and Elena was ready to see it through, no matter what came next. Thank you for reading through the entire story. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think of Elena's journey and the fight against corruption? Have you ever encountered situations involving racism in your life? Or do you have thoughts about the themes explored in this story? Your feedback truly means a lot to us, and we value each and every one of you. Please consider subscribing and liking this post if you enjoyed the story, and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd appreciate it if you could write a phrase that resonates with the themes of the story, so we can see who has been with us until the very end. Wishing you a great day ahead, and thank you again for your support.